Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm with eLearning Brothers. Today, we're going to be talking about the neuroscience of memorable messages. For those of you that are wondering, yes, this webinar is going to be recorded, and we will send a copy out to you later today. We will also post this webinar on our website, either later in this week or early next week. If you have questions during the webinar, please use the questions panel. We'll be ready to answer your questions. And I'll try to bring up as many of these questions as we can to Carmen. Speaking of Carmen, we do have Carmen Simon with us today. We also have Curtis Morley, our president here at eLearning Brothers. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Curtis, to introduce Carmen.
Thanks, Andrew. So I am so excited to have Carmen Simon with us today. I've been lucky enough to hear her keynote some fantastic conferences and meet her in person. She's an amazing individual, but she's also incredibly smart. She's one of the leading cognitive neuroscientists in the world and the author and founder of MEMSI, a company that uses brain science to help corporations create memorable messages. And she, like I said, she's truly one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, especially around this topic. I would put her up there with Charles Duhigg and Simon Sinek. I wonder if there's Carmen Simon, Simon Sinek. Anyway, we're so excited. Carmen's holds not just one, but two doctorates, one in instructional technology and another in cognitive psychology. And like I said, she speaks around the world, and we're so excited to have her because the topic that we have today is how to get the most out of storytelling and how to be memorable. And as instructional designers, as professionals in the e-learning world, this is key to having sticky e-learning, to having viral knowledge online. And instead of the boring point and click, now you can tell stories. And so I'm going to turn the time over to Carmen, and let's get ready to learn.
Thank you so much for such a memorable introduction, and welcome everyone. As we get this started, I'm reminded of a campaign that was requested by the company Colgate. I'm sure that everyone here on this webinar has heard of this company. They came up a few years ago with a new line of dental floss, not the most exciting product on the planet, but somebody has to advertise it so that it stays memorable. I'll show you 3 examples from the campaign that was done for them by a company in Brazil. Use the Q&A panel and tell me what you're noticing in these ads. Here is ad number 1. Here is ad number 2. And here is ad number 3. What did you notice in those ads? You can use the Q&A panel. We can see some of your responses. Curious to know where your attention went and what captured your focus.
A lot of these comments are coming in. Jennifer says there's crud in their teeth, dirty teeth, food stuck in the teeth. There's more. Melanie says there's gunk in the teeth. They need to be using their floss. Other comments, the size of the Colgate ad was one. There's good eye contact. Gross stuff in the man's teeth, dirty teeth. These people need to floss. There's another one there. One person says, I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but I believe the floss logo was in the corner.
Yeah, that's a good observation, and they're fairly inconspicuous with their ad placement, which is nice. They're focusing mainly on the problem, as all of you noticed through the comments that you sent in, and all of those are great observations. A few of you may have even commented that it's always a couple, and it's the guy that takes a hit. So more power to you guys, because the ego becomes secondary in order to point out a problem that can be fixed with the solution that Colgate offers. Let's go back to the ads and see if we focus a little bit more closely. Are there some other things that we're noticing? For example, in the upper left corner here in the picture, how many fingers does she have? As you're looking in the upper right corner, what's he missing? You may now notice that if you move your focus away from the debris in their teeth, there's something else that's at stake, and it's absent in this case. And here in the lower left corner, whose hand is this? So you see, the conclusion for their campaign was that, very much like you noticed, the food debris captures our attention so much to the point where we're almost willing to overlook some Photoshop surprises. For us as cognitive neuroscientists, this campaign has captured our attention simply because Colgate did something that all of us aspire at doing, which is capture attention long enough and stay on our minds long enough in order to influence decisions. And did it work for them? Yes, it did. As you're looking at the screen here, notice that when they compare themselves against Colgate, against Crest, which is their competition, Colgate came up ahead. So a few days later, when they tested people's memory of the campaign and their willingness to buy their product, they showed positive results in their favor. And that's the only reason that you want to be memorable. You want to be memorable because you want to influence behavior at some point. And I know that all of you here have some training or e-learning role functions or communication functions in general. And at some point, you want to stay on people's minds. And the only reason you want to do so is because the brain does not make any decisions in terms of what to do next unless there is memory involved. Memory, we can go as far as saying, moves the world, in the sense of, if you can even consider your own situation right now, there's no decision that you have made recently, or no decision that you will ever make, unless you remember something. In fact, use the Q&A panel and share with us a decision that you have made recently. It doesn't matter how small or large, something that you have decided to do or not to do. What is something in your life that you decided to act on?
Responses are coming in here. Whether or not to attend this webinar, to buy a car, that's one question. Whether or not to bring an umbrella to a day, to take a new job, to try to focus on being positive. 100 squats a day for 30 days. That's a great decision. Making my lunch to go on vacation.
We can learn from you, whether it's physical exercise or smart decisions to keep yourself protected from the rain, or attending a session like this to learn a little bit more about brain science. Those are great things. And I
have some pretty strong legs in there.
Yes, talk about memory moves the world. I love the idea of strong legs, by the way, because do you ever wonder, by the way, why is it that human beings have a brain? Before we comment on your recent responses for the decisions, let's invite you to type in something else. Why is it, do you think, that human beings have a brain?
Answers coming in. Survival is one thought for a brain. To learn, to support body function, to decide or to decipher the world around them. Survival's come up a few more times. All animals have a brain. To make choices, to reason, to help us stay alive, to cope, to help cope with the world.
Yeah, and all these are correct and interesting answers. And obviously, survival is the ultimate in our having a brain. And the remark about different species having brains, that's a good one as well. But just think about this way. The only reason, at the very basis of all that you just said, the only reason why we have a brain is so we can move. And there is a sea creature out there at the bottom of the sea that, once it finds its optimal spot for survival, which is the final goal, it eats its own brain simply because it doesn't have to move anymore. So the person who said we have a brain to support body functions, they're getting closer to the answer. And the person who has strong legs to do 100 squats a day is also on the right track, in the sense of, we have a brain so we can move. And our current audiences, our modern audiences, have a lot of options in their movement. They can move one way, they can move another direction. And one of the reasons that you decided to address and attend a webinar like this is because at some point you would like to create something memorable so people move in your direction. And there's no movement that the brain dictates to us to do unless there is memory involved. So when you say that you decided to take another job, the memory of money is probably strong enough in your conscious or subconscious. Sometimes we're not even aware of what memories we have that dictate what we do next. But whether you're bringing the umbrella to work, or you click attend this webinar, or you decide to work somewhere else, all of those decisions, small or large, are driven by memories. People act on what they remember, not on what they forget. So that's why I'm inviting you, as a result of this webinar, whatever you do from here on out, make memory your mission. And be very humbled by how much people remember and how much people forget. Because overall, we're noticing that your audiences, regardless of who they are or what they're after, tend to forget about 90% of what you share after 48 hours. Don't confuse this statistic with something that you may have heard in the past, which is we only remember 10% of what we see, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see and hear. Have you heard those statistics before? And if yes, don't repeat them any longer, because there's no scientific study out there that has proven such conveniently progressive statistics. What I'm mentioning that you see reflected here is based on this notion, theory, and formula, even that's called the forgetting curve, which states this: whenever your audiences come to your information without the intent to remember, they forget fast at first and slower later. So we know that your audiences will forget the bulk of what you share. Let's look at this number as a metaphorical 90% that they forget, because especially when business is concerned, it's almost impossible, scientifically speaking, to place a strict statistic as to how much people forget and how much they remember. We know that it's very little. Luckily, though, the little that they remember, this metaphorical 10%, is stable over time. So after the 48 hours, the little that stays in their brains stays there for a long time. So this is where we have an opportunity. And the question becomes, when people attend your content, whether it's a live session, very much like we're doing right now, whether it's an on-demand e-learning program, whether it's a brochure that you have shared with them, or just a simple email or a conversation, are they taking away the right 10%? Because otherwise, if you're not in control of this message, the 10% that people take away tends to be random. So to add to the misery of loss of memory, not only do people forget a lot, but the little they remember is at random. I'm going to say this again because this is a strong statement and we must be humbled by it. The little that people remember from the content that you share tends to be at random unless you take charge of it. So that's where we're looking at brain science to see, can we control the 10% that audiences remember? And that's the premise.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Carmen. I love that statement. Are they remembering the right 10%? That's one of the takeaways that I'm gonna use in my day-to-day interactions.
Excellent. So if I could provide a mantra for all of our attendees for the rest of the year, it would be this: control your 10%. Control your 10%. Otherwise, you're leaving it to chance. I'm embarrassed to admit, for example, I was attending a keynote presentation not too long ago, and after 45 minutes of listening to that person speak, the only thing that I remember is him saying that 17% of people in Italy believe that it's okay to have sex and text at the same time. And I bet you if somebody had asked that presenter, what would you like your audience to say about your message 48 hours later, that statistic would not have been one of his highlights. So you see, when you're not in control of a message, you're leaving that message to chance. Random memory does not help with your quest of influencing people to move towards you. So we always start when we coach people how to create memorable messages. We teach brain science workshops, or we design their own content. We start from this premise of it's important to be memorable. Quite often we know that the reason people are not memorable is because audiences don't pay attention to begin with. Attention paves the way to memory. Is it possible for us to remember something that we don't consciously pay attention to? Scientifically speaking, the answer is yes, but we're not in the business of subliminal messages by any sort. So let's consider this as focused attention. And the only reason why you want to convince people to pay attention and remember you, very much like Colgate did, is because you want to influence where they move next, and hopefully that's towards you. A combination of these three pillars have to be the foundation of any modern communicator. So whether you're working in training or sales, marketing, regardless of your profession now or in the future, if you start mastering from a brain science perspective these three pillars, you can indeed claim that you're in the business of influencing what people do next and where they move next. So always start with this question: what do I want people to remember? If you have the clarity of this, you're more likely to influence where they go next. It's unfortunate, however, that there is an abundance of messaging these days. There is no shortage of information. I'm sure that everybody would agree. So that's why our task in the clarity of the 10% becomes even more fierce these days. I'm noticing as we coach a lot of people on getting to the essence of their message and to the clarity of the 10%, that sometimes they're misled by this notion that if we have an agenda or if we have some sort of an organized manner of showing our thoughts, very much like you see here on the screen, then surely we're okay. Maybe this is a 10% message. And that's not true. It's nice that you're organizing thoughts in an agenda format. That's good. The brain loves organization because in its movement, it likes to control the environment. And an advanced organizer like this gives you the notion of control, which is nice. But it's impossible for people to remember this many concepts after 48 hours. The word agenda should be and must be a trigger for all of you listening to this from here on out, that a strong 10% message is needed to tie all of these other concepts that fall underneath it. So consider this. Find a 10% message that is unifying all of your other messages, and all of your other messages, if you want to make them memorable, cannot be any more than 3-4 max, because the brain will not retain that many more after 2 days. It's not impossible for people to say, well, but I have 7 messages maybe, or 8 or 14, whatever else does justice to your content. So it's not like your business content will always render itself nicely to 1 main message and 3 or 4 supporting points. But when it doesn't, just know that people will only remember the gist of what you're saying and not specifics from what you're saying. Now use the Q&A panel and tell me your opinion. Which one do you think is more preferable from your audience's brain's perspective? Would they like specifics to remember or the gist of information? What do our audiences find easier, gist or verbatim?
It looks like the majority of these early responses is the gist. A lot more people interested in the gist. There's a few votes for specifics. But there's definitely a higher majority of people wanting the gist.
You're definitely on the right track, because the brain is a cognitively lazy organ. So we would much rather sit back and be exposed to some information and not really be required to remember anything in specific. However, from your perspective, your developer's brain's perspective, what's more important and what will do an even bigger justice to your cause would be to go for some specifics, because when you have strong specifics, that's your differentiator. Because imagine this, if your audiences are learning your gist in some way, but then they also listen to your competition and they also get the gist from that, and they listen to somebody else and they also get the gist from that, after 48 hours or even longer, they will give credit to the more familiar source. So sometimes you might end up doing somebody else's presentation or delivering somebody else's content. To remember, a main point from this is displayed here on the screen. If you want to aspire at being memorable, make sure that you have the clarity of the 10% message. Because as we work with tons and tons of content from various organizations, that's by far the biggest problem that I'm noticing. People want to be memorable, they just don't know what they want to be memorable for. And that's a profound...
Carmen, I've got a question here. Vanessa asks, does breaking the delivery down into smaller chunks and spacing the message help to build, to accumulate information? For example, one message, then you gather 10%, and then you teach the other half of the message later, and you get another 10%. Does that really add up to 20% of your overall message is being gleaned?
Ooh, I like where you're going in terms of math. So let's ponder this for a second, because you're asking a very strong question. I'm really enjoying it. I would advise this: if you have a fairly complex message, and most businesses these days do, make sure that your 10% does not change across the board, regardless of how many chunks you have. So let's just say that your content renders itself in 7 chunks or 14 chunks. That 10% message does not change. And I'll give you an example, and I'll come back to that, the spreading of the message item as well. So let's take this, for example. It's always nice to come up with some good 10% examples, when we're looking outside of the business world. And here's this author, maybe some people here on the webinar have heard of him. He teaches at UC Berkeley. Brilliant writer. It's not necessarily that we're recommending the book or anything, but what I'm enjoying most about this is that he has a very clear 10% message in what he's offering. He's saying here, as you can see in the title, he's defending food. So the 10% message does not change across the 200 plus pages, very much that it must not across X chunks that you have in your e-learning program. To this content, he has 3 main supporting points. He's advising us to eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So what I'm admiring most about this message is that there is one unifying theme here. I'm defending food. And as you're doing so, here are 3 pillars that support this. So coming back to the chunking of the messaging, doesn't matter how many you have, it would be nice if at a very broad level, as you're looking at all the chunks, if you're teaching something across 1 week, or sometimes companies have a month-long onboarding program, for example, it's nice if you have overall 3 or 4, no more, supporting messages or pillars. And then all the chunks then go underneath each as the message becomes a lot more complex. This way, regardless of where people are in their learning journey, if they reflect on your message, this message comes to mind easily. In fact, if you're fascinated by these concepts and by brain science and creating memorable content, a topic that you can do a little bit more research on your own is this concept called cognitive ease, which simply means enabling the brain to recall something easily. Because otherwise, imagine this, it is possible for your audiences to remember more than 3 or 4 things. Because with enough repetition and with enough distribution, like you very wisely said earlier, you expose the brain often enough to something, after a while, they will remember. That's not a problem. And there is no secret to memory. Repetition is the mother of memory. But later on, if you're asking people to recall 7 things, it takes a lot more cognitive energy in order to bring those to mind compared to 3 or 4. So people may remember more from your content, but they will not look at your content favorably. This is a strong point, so I'll make it again. Don't think of enabling people to remember more of your content. Enable them to remember fewer things, but better things, and that enables cognitive ease. So as you move on and you're reflecting on this concept, always wonder, what's your 10% message? What's something that unifies your entire topic, regardless of how complex it is? And can you make it be supported by 3 or 4 points max? And then underneath that, you can add some complexity that will render itself to gist, and that's fine. But at least this is how you're balancing the best of both worlds. Because if you have one main message and one main message only, supported by only a few points, those will come to mind easily, and you can aspire at specifics. Hopefully those specifics are strong enough to differentiate you from other people. And then from then on, everything else will fall under gist, and that's where you develop all sorts of handouts and job aids and all sorts of performance tools, because it's impossible for the human brain to recollect that much. So use the Q&A panel and tell us, as you're reflecting on your content right now, what's your 10% message? What are you working on right now? And perhaps you have reached a point where there's the joy of clarity. Let us share that joy with you, because that's not an easy point to reach. The clarity of the 10% sometimes comes with a lot of sweats and a lot of tears.
All right, these responses are coming in. Different people's 10%. One is policy compliance, stop, think, and listen. Another one is personal empowerment. Medication reviews improve health outcomes. Make sure you follow the procedure. Federal law compliance. The importance of documentation. Regulatory readiness.
I'm really enjoying this list because it shows a lot of effort in the sense of getting to the essence of a topic. And for those of you who have phrased your 10% messages, the clarity of your script, so to speak, as verbs, you have an extra advantage. We were saying earlier that the brain is a cognitively lazy organ. So whenever you get the chance, tell the brain what to do in your 10% message. That's yet another way that you're bridging the gap between memory and decision-making, memory and influencing the brain where to move next. So when one of our attendees says, stop, think, and listen, see how it's a lot stronger because it's guiding us towards motion already versus saying policy compliance, which now makes us think a little bit more. And given the choice to the brain to think or not to think, I'm sure that you know what the answer is. So if we're saying control your 10% as a mantra, and as, by the way, the 10% message that I'd like for you to retain as a result of this webinar, make sure you determine what that is, because you can't control that which you don't determine first. So that's the first step in our journey to control our 10%, and implicitly to control where people move next. And because our time is limited today, we mentioned these 3 pillars. Let's look a little bit more here, because it's harder to, not impossible, but harder to become memorable unless people pay attention to you first. So let's see, what does brain science tell us in terms of how we capture and sustain someone's attention? One concept that I know for sure works from the field of neuroscience and cognitive psychology is this concept of mental models. What does a mental model mean? It simply means a script or a template that the brain tends to form as it is exposed to its environment. So for example, we have a lot of mental models for attending a business meeting or even a webinar like this, or when you go to the grocery store or to the airport, or as you're picturing your national anthem. Perhaps we have international participants in this call. Consider the grocery store for a moment. Do you ever go to the grocery store and they switch things on you? That means they're messing with your mental model. They're messing with the script that you have formed to process your environment. It will be very difficult for the brain if it had to process everything as if it was new all the time. So the brain enjoys mental models, or sometimes we call them schemas, because they help us conserve cognitive energy. You see, in that movement that the brain enables us to make, the brain also consumes a lot of energy. So whenever it finds the occasion to conserve it, it will always take that opportunity. This is why people fall asleep in presentations. Whenever we find the occasion to conserve cognitive energy, we will take it. That's why mental models or schemas are so juicy to the brain. Notice as you're watching my screen, what happens if I mess with one of your linguistic schemas. I guarantee that as you're reading this sentence on the screen, you had to read it a few times until you could finally fit it within an existing linguistic mental model that your brain has built. So you're a choreographer of respecting or twisting some mental models that exist in your audience's brains. But just know this, in terms of attention, whenever you're giving your audiences something that they already know, a familiar mental model, you can already guarantee that you have their attention, simply because we tend to pay attention more to that which we already know and recognize. Do you ever buy a new car? Speaking of making the decision of buying a new car earlier on, and now everybody on the highway is and their grandmother is driving the same car that you have just bought, where you're thinking, oh, so much for standing out. Our attention already expands when we are looking at something that we recognize, something that's familiar. There's another advantage that we get out of familiarity. It's not only saving us cognitive energy, but it's also enabling us to predict better. And the brain has been designed to constantly be on fast forward. And why is that? Many of you mentioned survival as the ultimate in the brain's function and existence. And that's a strong answer. We want to survive. In order to improve our biological fitness, we do it better if we can predict what happens next, if we can predict where to move next, so to speak. And whenever something is familiar, that means it helps us with our predictions. It helps us predict better. This is why, and this is going to be a very unusual statement I'm about to make, there's very little evolutionary value in the present. In fact, if I were to ask you, and you can type this in the Q&A panel as well, how many of you meditate? I'm curious if we have some listeners on the webinar who are deep into meditation practice. I bet that if we were to do a survey, we wouldn't have a high percentage, simply because meditation, which is one of its functions, is bringing the brain here into the present, is so darn hard. And for those attendees who are reporting indeed meditating, would you agree that when you first started that practice, it was one of the hardest things you've ever done? simply because you're asking the brain to do something unnatural, which is be here right now. Where does the brain want to be? In the future. And how does it know where to go into the future? Is by going into the past, recollecting memories that have served you well, so that you know where to move next. Being here right now, very difficult.
Carmen, I've just actually started learning to meditate, and you're right. I feel like a 2-year-old as my brain skitters across the room, and trying to bring it back into the present and focus is a very challenging task. It's been fun as I've done it day by day to rein that in, but absolutely, it likes to skitter around the room.
As far as our audience goes, there's quite a few people that are meditating, and many of them agree that it's very difficult, especially when starting, to stay focused on one thing at a time.
It's excruciating, and thank you for your genuine comments too, by the way. And the key phrase that you just offered was day to day, because obviously the more that you practice, we said earlier, there is no secret behind memory. It's repetition. Then you can train yourself into doing it better. But when you're creating content for your audiences, don't put too much pressure on yourselves in terms of surprising them with something that's new all the time. Just know that an existing mental model and appealing to something familiar works very well in terms of attracting attention, simply because you're not asking the brain to work too hard. So reflect on your content right now and wonder, what I'm saying, does it fit an existing mental model that the audience already has? And when the answer is yes, you have an increased chance at attention. And if you have attention, you're more likely to have memory. If you have memory, you're more likely to have the decision to move towards you. Do you ever listen to the Dalai Lama speak? Since we're talking about meditation and the various practices, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with him. Anytime he speaks in front of large audiences, and which he does fairly often, 1,000+ people who come to listen to him speak, he brings his translator that you see here. And in this one circumstance, he was speaking, and he speaks for about 2 minutes, and people are waiting for the translator to pick up. He's not taking any notes, so they're thinking, okay, surely any minute he's going to stop and he's going to pick it up. And he doesn't stop. 5 minutes go by and he still hasn't stopped. He hasn't taken any notes. He hasn't said anything. 10 minutes go by, 15 minutes go by. Finally, he stops. And this guy picks up and starts translating. Of course, we have to think that what he's saying is true. And you would think at those levels, they don't lie. So he's starting to speak fluidly without having taken any notes. I mean, imagine, we forget our lives almost as quickly as we live them. So for this person to remember 15 minutes worth of information, knowing that we speak at about 140 to about 160 words per minute, multiply those by 15, that's a lot of words that he said that he would have had to hold in his working memory and bring to mind when needed. That's amazing. So at the end of this event, journalists are clamoring on stage not to talk to him, the celebrity. They want to talk to this guy because they want to know what in the world happened. How is he able? How is he capable of such an amazing feast of memory? So he's saying it's easy. Whatever mental model he's speaking from, I have the exact same one. I know exactly where his brain is at when he's speaking about certain concepts. So this is why he can go on for 15 minutes without stopping, and he can translate without taking any notes because they share the same mental model. And unfortunately, what I'm noticing in business is that quite often you have a mental model and the audience has a different one. So it's no wonder that memory is a little bit harder, because we tend to pay extra and sharper attention to that which we already know. If we were to translate this into the world of business, for example, one of our clients is Aptus. This is, I'm curious if anybody on the call has heard of them. They're with us here in the Bay Area. And it's a software company that promises to automate this journey from quote to cash. So let's just say you have a company that submits a proposal to another company. So from that proposal, from the quote that you make to a client to the moment that you get the cash for your services, Aptus promises to automate that entire journey. So what they did very cleverly is they created this piece of software and these algorithms, not from scratch, but notice how very subtly here, they're integrated with Salesforce. So they're already going where the attention of their audiences is already. So can you investigate the mental models that already exist for your audiences? And when you tap into those and you link your content to those, you have extra chances at attention, therefore memory, therefore decision making. And if we're talking about where people pay attention, that means you're going where their habits already are. This is a strong statement. So consider this. Attention quite often is habitual. We tend to look at familiar things, like we said. That means you're building some habits. And from a neuroscience perspective, we know a lot about the anatomy of habits. For example, there is this area in our brain called the striatum, which houses our habits. Obviously, it has some other functions that you see here listed on the screen. But if your phone, if your leg ever vibrates, does your leg ever vibrate and your phone is not even there? This is because of a habit that you have formed, which is housed right there. So we've learned a lot about where people's attention goes habitually. We even made it to the point where, in terms of habitual attention, we can ask the question of, can a monkey build a habit on its own? And the answer is yes. So for example, if you expose a monkey to a grid of dots, very much like you see here, and once the eyes of the monkey hit a specific dot, it gets squirted with a little juice, which the monkey finds rewarding. In time, the monkey learns on its own where to look very quickly without wasting energy, so that it receives the reward faster. It understands that if it builds that habit, it will get to the reward at a smaller cost, with less energy. And if we were to put this monkey's brain in an fMRI condition, we're noticing that there's less and less cognitive energy involved in the journey to the reward. So it's no wonder that your audiences are very similar. They're looking for the path of least resistance. We love indulging in our habits. We love to go where our attention already is. So make sure you answer this question of mental models to a point, because if we're only going where attention habitually goes, after a while, the brain does habituate. I'm sure you see the connection, habits, habituation. And habituation simply means that after you have exposed your audiences to specific content, they no longer pay attention to it because their brain will have gotten adjusted to that stimulus. So say, for instance, you go to your office in the morning, there's some radio, music in the background. At first, that will capture your attention. And after a while, it does just that. It falls into the background. In fact, use the Q&A panel and share with us, what are some things that you have habituated to in your own offices? What are some stimuli that no longer capture your attention, even though they're fairly intense?
All right, some comments coming in. Coworkers talking, repeat emails, the air conditioner, Skype, Facebook notifications, the noise of other people on the phone, the smell of coffee, the noise of the clock, the scent of, the hum of overhead vents, footsteps in the hallway, people walking by my office. Lots of background noise in an open office concept.
That's exactly right. So imagine that in all of these scenarios that you're describing, habituation has evolutionary value, because you would go crazy if those footsteps would capture your attention as if they were new every single time. If those coworkers' voices, or if the sound of your air conditioning system would get your attention every single time, you would go nuts. Imagine if you couldn't habituate to the sound of your own breathing. So habituation has evolutionary value. Unfortunately, as we're reflecting on these things, we're also realizing that human brains habituate so darn fast. Take communication, for instance. In the beginning, we were just habituate and communicating face to face, and that was fine. Then we habituated to that stimulation and to that reward. So we started coming up with new means of communication, and we improved on those. And then we got habituated to that stimulation and to those rewards. So we kept on improving on those, and we improved a little bit further because we got habituated to those. And these days, if you're flying and your internet connection is down at 40,000 feet in the air, life is over as you know it. Speaking of habituation, it's important to reflect that we habituate not only on stimulation, but on the rewards that we get out of that stimulation. So use the Q&A panel again and tell us something that you have habituated to in terms of rewards. Like, what is something that you used to get so excited about and now is just kind of blah? It's just such a mundane norm.
So Carmen, I'm reminded of this every time I have a guest over to eLearning Brothers. We have a very fun office, great culture. We have mannequins around the office. We have just a very vibrant color scheme. And we have what we call the Wall of Fame with crazy memorabilia all over the place. And it's not until I bring other people in that they're so impressed with the office, and and they're surprised all the time by every corner they take of the office. There's something new and surprising. But to everyone that works here, it's just normal. That's part of the day to day.
It's totally normal. I was talking to somebody the other day who is blessed enough to work down here in Southern California and have an ocean view. And he said he doesn't even notice it anymore. Talk about habituating to rewards and stimulation. That's so rewarding to somebody traveling from a space where they don't have an ocean view, that when they visit his office, they go, wow, this is amazing. This is the best place to work. And he doesn't notice it anymore. What are some other answers we're getting? Thank you for sharing.
Some other answers that have come in, a paycheck is one, going to the beach, being able to look anything up at any time on my phone rather than having to go to the library and look it up. Superhero movies, that's another one. IMs, Facebook notifications, coffee walk with the team, waiting for a movie to come to DVD.
I love these examples. I mean, imagine we have habituated to the reward of a paycheck. Talk about first world problems. I'm reminded of reading something from this person who was complaining that her high heels got stuck in the floor of a yacht. I mean, we're habituating to rewards so fast, and just know that your audiences are not any different. So what do? To get the best of both worlds, we have to go to where familiarity is, but we also have to twist it a little bit to prevent the brain from habituating. So imagine this. This is an example from a bookstore somewhere in Israel. And just like any bookstore, what do they want? They want customers to go into the store, buy the book. So how did they do their advertising? Notice how very cleverly they combined familiarity plus an element of surprise. So as you're looking at your content, wonder this: what is an existing and habitual mental model that my audiences have, and can I twist it just slightly? Because Curtis, for those mannequins that you're describing, if you every so often put different clothes on them, or different wigs, or different outfits, or different accessories in some way, I bet you that now you can jolt your audiences out of their habituation.
It's funny you say that, because occasionally one of the mannequins is named Picasso, and we can separate him at the waist, and occasionally he'll end up behind doors and in people's chairs as they come to work, and yeah, that definitely gets a reaction. It's quite fun.
Exactly. So as you're pondering your own content or even products that you have, now that you're mentioning the mannequins, can you play within an existing framework? Because sometimes the mistake that we make in business is that we add so much variety to the point where nothing really stands out. I'm not surprised that one of our participants mentioned the superhero movies to which we have habituated, because there's just so much variety, but at some point we don't really know, does anybody stand out in some way? So take a framework that exists for your audiences and see if you can twist it slightly. Take the Mona Lisa, for instance. If you went to Google and you typed in Mona Lisa variations, you would see her in all sorts of different contexts, with all sorts of different hair, with all sorts of different accessories, very much like Curtis mannequins. Hey, that could be a good title for your book, Curtis. Curtis mannequins. I think that there's a good ring to that. But the only reason while you're smiling, while you're smiling at any of these pictures that you've seen, is because you're familiar with the original. So don't feel that you have to put so much novelty in what you're creating. Go to where your audience's habits and attention already exists, and see if you can twist the familiar.
There is a quick question that's popped up here. Is there a danger of not seeing the difference with taking a known framework?
That's exactly where the danger is, and that's why I'm providing this twisting the familiar technique. Because if you're only going to the familiar, there is the danger of boredom. Like, I've seen this before. And with there is the other extreme, however, where you're twisting things too much. So you're always playing in these extremes of boredom and versus weirdness. So when something feels too familiar, it's boring. When something is too twisted, it's weird. So you are the choreographer. It's in your hands of how much you want to play with these proportions. But the point is this: have something that already feels familiar to the brain, because you'll enable cognitive ease and familiarity, that notion of being able to predict what happens next, with a slight twist so that attention is still granted. So there you have it. We're starting to build some guidelines here, and we'll have a few more before we finish the session. Especially since I'm sensing that we're talking about this notion of habituation, and since we're invoking brain science, we can ask this question: what really happens in our brains when we habituate? And the answer has to do with this neurotransmitter that you see listed here on the screen. I'm sure that everybody on the webinar, no exception, has heard of this before. This has been so widely addressed in studies to the point where we're calling it the Kim Kardashian of neurotransmitters, which I don't think is fair to dopamine. But we used to believe that dopamine is something that you had in your brain in order to crave and like something. But what we're finding out more recently is this: you don't have to have dopamine in your brain in order to crave chocolate, for instance. You have to have dopamine in your brain to go get it. So there is a strong correlation between the presence of this chemical and your drive, your ability, your motivation to move. Since we were talking about that's the only reason why we have a brain. And how do we know this? Imagine you take a rat, you identify the area in its brain that secretes dopamine, and you put an electrode there. You teach the rat to press a lever so that each time it does, it gets excited in that area, and this chemical gets transmitted. And because obviously there's still the reward and there's still the pleasure that's associated with this that feels so good, the rat is willing to go through this motion again and again and again and again until it dies. Not a bad way to go for the rat, but still what we're noticing is this concept of the more this chemical exists in your audience's brains, the greater the effort that they're willing to go and exert in your favor. So if we aspire at motion, so we want to be memorable so that we influence where people move next, and hopefully it's towards you, that means the question becomes, how do we ensure that our audiences, as they listen to you, have enough of this in their brains? And we can find out some answers that are related to that question. We look at some other experiments. For instance, let's just say you take a monkey and you do a similar experiment as the one with the rat. So you're promising it something rewarding. In this case, it's bananas, if it presses a lever. And already the reward is present there, so it knows that it will receive something in return of the effort. Dopamine level will go up. But we're starting to find out more things. For example, if in that room where this experiment takes place, you put a signal, let's just say a light, which announces the beginning of the experiment. So the monkey hasn't done any effort, but he hasn't received the reward just yet. It just builds the anticipation of something good that's about to happen. Dopamine level goes up even more. So quite often it's not so much about the act itself, but it's the anticipation of the act, the anticipation of pleasure that gets this chemical to be in our brains in a higher dose. And I'm mentioning this because the way we correlate it with the way that you do your training and your business content, how often then do you create anticipation for what's to happen? Somebody said earlier that they made the decision to attend this webinar. One of the reasons people come and they join is because the organizers do a very good job creating anticipation for something that's rewarding and that will serve you well in your job. So build anticipation. Have you ever taken a trip and the preparation for the trip was more exciting and rewarding to you than the trip itself? This is because this chemical was in a higher dose during that anticipation phase that it may have been during the event itself. And there is one more finding that will serve you well. We started asking, what happens if you don't give the reward every single time the effort is performed? What happens if sometimes you go through the motions and you press the lever, sometimes metaphorically speaking, and you get something, but sometimes you get nothing? What if you introduced uncertainty? What if there was a maybe? And when there's uncertainty, we're noticing that dopamine level goes up even more. So dare to go there in the sense of Sometimes in business content, we feel that, oh, we have to make everything so certain and so obvious, but that's not always the case. Can you include something that's not always so obvious? Can you have just a small amount of uncertainty? And by the way, if you kill any of these three elements in any of the content that you're creating, you're less likely to have people perform some actions and physically move, because at some point people will physically move towards you, even if it's just doing nothing but click next in your e-learning program. That's still a physical motion that they do towards you. So ponder this, because these are strong questions that we can all ask as we aspire at attention, therefore memory, therefore the decision to move. There's only that much temporary pleasure that you get when you make everything so obvious for your audiences. True and false is great, but after a while, boring. When you're adding something that's a little bit more uncertain, and uncertainty is quite often linked to complexity, now you can aspire at holding our attention for a little longer. This is why it's such a myth, and we use science to debunk some of these myths, by the way. It's such a myth that we should simplify our complexity. No, that couldn't be further from the truth, because simplicity after a while becomes a snoozer. It's complexity that gets the brain to stay in there a little bit longer. So the mantra should be not necessarily simplifying your complexity, but rather helping the brain manage it well. So if we're talking about uncertainty, there's even a formula that scientists are offering us in terms of what's welcomed uncertainty. I'm saying welcomed because if you're waiting for a doctor's diagnostic, for instance, or some news, and that may not be favorable, that's not necessarily a good uncertainty. But imagine this, imagine an election where candidates are so closely skilled, and or a tennis tournament where all the players have comparable skills, especially in that first week of a major Grand Slam. Anything can happen in any kind of sequence, and it makes it so fun to stay there because we can't predict, you see, what happens next. And if you're asking, well, how can we do this? Well, you can give your audiences some alternatives, you can create some suspense, you can enable them to discover something, don't always make it so obvious. So here we can prove this right now. Here's a minute and 17 seconds exercise that I have for you. I'd love for you to take your phones. I know that you really want to touch them, and take a quick picture of your shoes and tell us with just one or two sentences, what story, since we're talking about storytelling earlier, what story could your shoes tell? Maybe they've seen something amazing. Maybe they have been to a place that we should all know about. Maybe they have seen something they shouldn't have. And email us a quick picture. I'll switch my computer screen so that we can see some of your entries. Take exactly a minute and 17 seconds, and then we'll bring the session to a strong close. I'll set a quick alarm for us, and while people are taking pictures of their shoes, they're sharing a quick story. Curtis or Andrew, are you noticing any other outstanding questions?
Could I share my shoe story with you while we're getting
please.
Those? So today I'm wearing a pair of Ultra running shoes, and the story that these shoes have to tell are that about a year and a half ago, I started doing an experiment to see if an average Joe could become a first place winner in a triathlon. And this gym here locally, we trained every day for a couple hours, and it took about 9-10 months. And if you saw me in the very first triathlons, you would have laughed your head off, because I come out of the swim and there's only 3 people behind me, and every single one of them had to be 90 years old. I swear. But these are the shoes that crossed the finish line in first place in my age group after about 10 months of intensive training.
That is wonderful. What an inspiring story, and thank you so much for sharing this.
There are some other questions that we can speak to for a few moments. A lot of people have brought up micro-learning. We've got a lot of e-learners here that use micro e-learning to get their modules across, and they want to know if that is more effective and helps knowledge retention more than a traditional lengthy course, especially when compared with the importance of complex thoughts as opposed to these micro-learning situations.
Yeah, the advantage that you're getting out of microlearning is obviously the cognitive ease. Because if you're telling somebody, look, you can view this 2 to 3 minute video and gain some skills, let's just say, in having better social interactions, obviously I would very much watch that than read a book that has 256 pages. The caution that I have about microlearning is to make sure that all of your microlearning bites are still tied by one strong 10% message, because otherwise those pieces could be seen at random. And by the way, since we're talking about complexity, it's not complexity or abundance that's ultimately killing us in business content. It's the randomness that's hurting us. So yes, give the cognitive ease to the brain through these micro pieces, but just make sure that when you arrange them into a bigger whole, they're still tied by one unifying message and a few supporting points that people can bring to mind, regardless if they attended to 10 of your pieces, 20, 100 of them. Are they still tied by some sort of a pattern versus randomness? And I'm getting some good examples here. Let me switch my computer screen really quick so I can share some of your examples, and we can display the conclusion of our session. So here are some boots that have helped Kevin, he says, get more exercise. So see, Curtis, you're inspiring people, go to and from the gym and help me be more active and healthy. And here are the good boots that are exercise partners. And here's Lita says, my favorite shoes are no shoes, and tell the story of being able to be at home with the family when working. And here's a good journey towards a balanced lifestyle. Thank you for inspiring us as well. Angela says, these shoes are the sole survivors of my extensive shoe collection, which was destroyed with my home in the Northern California fires last October. Our hearts go out to you, Angela, and thank you so much for sharing this. See, it's a story with a strong context. Thank you for sending that. Jennifer says, these shoes were a Christmas gift. They are kid-sized. My feet are small, but I'm always having fun and enjoying life. That's very sweet. Probably not too many people could walk in your shoes, but we love your story, and thank you so much for sending this. Rebecca says, these shoes give me confidence to be different but appealing at the same time. I also love the sound they make when I walk because they sound like high heels, but I have the comfort of flats. So let's see them in their true glory. And that's wonderful. That's a great picture as well. Here, let's click on more. I love the flat shoes, Kelly says. After having 3 kids, heels definitely suck. We can feel for you, and we can feel your story. Thank you so much for sharing these. I have been running this exercise for quite some time. In fact, if you look here at my screen, many of these pictures are very similar to the ones that you have sent. Notice how in just a few short sentences you can relate to someone, and you can feel for their stories, very much like we did for yours. And see, we have a cousin of one of our participants here. And somebody was really paying attention to when I was delivering the session in terms of dopamine. As you can see, some are very, very touching, and they have a context that's just as strong as the Southern California story that we just heard. Here's some confession that somebody was making to us during the session. And you can see how many of these are provoking a reaction. Obviously, in addition to repetition, memory definitely gets us to an emotion gets us to remember something. But the reason that I enabled this exercise is to remind you that you don't always have to make something so obvious. Just make sure that in whatever you do, you leave some room for some uncertainty, because if we are looking at some of these things, you can make things very, very clear for somebody, but you're not generating that dopamine in their brains. There was a study that was done a while back in, speaking of California, this was UC Berkeley. The scientist was hiding lettuce for monkeys under one of the 2 cups. And he was noticing that if he took the monkeys out of the room, they knew exactly where to go to find the lettuce. After a while, he switched things and he started hiding a banana under one of the 2 cups. And obviously the monkey was so excited because now the reward is a bit bigger. And after a while, the scientist did something mean. Instead of hiding a banana now, to which the brain had habituated and the reward, he started going back to lettuce. and the monkey would refuse to eat the lettuce, which months before he found so rewarding. So contemplate your messages and wonder this: are you giving your audiences lettuce when they expect bananas? And are you creating enough, just a small percentage of uncertainty where you can get more of that chemical in their brain? Here's the conclusion of our session here, and there are a few more items that you can reflect on. You can send me an email to for a handout if you wish, and I'm hoping you'll join us in one of our brain science sessions to learn a few more of these principles formally. And just know that memory moves the world, and if you make it your mission, you'll indeed convince your audiences to move in your favor. Curtis, back to you.
Thanks so much, Carmen. This was fascinating. We've all been enlightened tremendously, and I will have that as a mantra. You know, which 10% is my audience remembering, and is it the right 10%? So we've truly been honored. Thank you all for joining us today. As a reward, speaking of lettuce and bananas, as a reward for joining us, we're going to give everyone on the webinar a free trial of our PowerPoint templates so that you can be memorable, like Carmen has talked about today. And if you have any other questions or thoughts, please feel free to write in, let us know. And in order to get the free templates, just go ahead and give Jeff a call. So make sure you call Jeff at 801-796-2767. Yes, that does spell bros, because we're the Learning Brothers. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great day. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, everyone.